That's a nice little signal maybe to start.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
okay.
Let's do it.
Great to see so many people, and thanks for coming tonight. And people I know, people I don't know, so good. Look forward to meeting you later. And my name is Jen, and we're really delighted you could join tonight. I'll be helping to host a conversation with Tim Jackson here on the care economy. So Tim and I think I met you 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah, closer to 15, I think.
I haven't seen him since then, pretty much. When I was working at WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, in a role in sustainability. So no, I was involved with your Centre for Understanding Sustainability work at University of Surrey, so we met there. And yeah, haven't been really in touch since, but I've been tracking your work over time as an author, as an activist, as an academic. My work now is in health. I work in the health sector for NHS Confederation. It's a membership body, the Q community, helping to improve the health and care sector. I'm also interested in nature-based solutions for health, so I think that's part of where we're kind of reconnected. So yeah, I've been tracking your work, and I've read The Care Economy, and really delighted to share and interviewing you in a more dialogue style with some questions to explore that further. And I've read the book twice. I love it so much. I'll probably read it again. And I just found it a very insightful, inspiring, intelligent book. A real joy to read, for those of you who can imagine have read it. I found it a joy as well. It's a real kind of adventure and unfolding. And I must say, it's one of those books that has like profoundly shifted the way that I see things and the way that I understand one of the most pressing issues that I believe faces our time. You know, what is the basis for how we organize ourselves and enable prosperity and vitality for all of life in this finite planet, planetary boundaries. So I think with that, there could be no better timing for this book. And I do believe, I think this could be a book that could really shift how we pay attention and to really understand what matters for our collective well-being and for our individual selves. So yeah, real delight and honor to host you in this conversation. And yeah, really look forward to it. So the way it'll work, we've got 45 minutes for conversation between us. Come on in, there's some seats up here. Yeah. 45 minutes, and I'll be exploring with you some of the themes, central themes, and a conversation around the book. And then we'll have another 45 minutes for a general conversation for you to ask questions and comments, and really engage with Tim around some of these themes. So start thinking about those as we go through. And then at the end, you see there's some books over there. You can purchase them if you don't have them already. Book signing will be that as well. And we go. The room will be available here till 9 o'clock. So it's a really nice time to hang out as well. And as you notice, we will be recording, so just to let you know about that. There'll be no breaks, so if you do need a loo, there's a loo downstairs on the ground floor, so just head down there. I think that's all I needed to say. Yeah, that's good. Great. So, over the last 15 years or so, you've written 3 seminal books. Read the first one, The Prosperity Without Growth, Post-Growth,
Yep.
Life After Capitalism, and then now The Care Economy. So what I noticed, it does feel like there's a little bit of a trilogy going on with these 3 seminal books. And I'm just really curious about if you can maybe share more about, is there a link between these books, and why did you write this one? Why now?
Yeah, there is definitely a link. So to go back to Prosperity Without Growth, that had its origins in the work that I was doing for the Sustainable Development Commission. And our kind of defining question for that work was, what can prosperity possibly mean, particularly when you're living on a finite planet? And so we started, the aim of that was as a kind of inquiry to ask the question, if the economy is getting bigger and bigger all the time and the planet isn't, at some point that meets a crunch. And then if we define prosperity itself in terms of that bigger and bigger economy, then you're kind of left with nowhere to go except the idea that there might be some magical technology which, as the economy gets bigger and bigger, could save us from all the impacts of the economy which is getting bigger and bigger. And it almost has that dynamic of an addiction. What do you turn to solve the problem of the thing that you had an overdose of already? The only solution to growth and the impacts it has on the planet is more growth, and therefore potentially bigger impacts on the planet. And we did a couple of things in that. one of the themes was to explore this question as the economy gets bigger, could you decouple its impacts? Could you make it more efficient? Could you change the technologies? Could you, yes, do come forwards, come forwards. We have space in the front here. Yeah. But another question was what is this thing that we call prosperity? What does it actually mean? And when you go back to the origins of the word, prosperes, a little bit of a Latin lesson, it means in accordance with our hopes and our expectations. So it doesn't in itself define itself as income or wealth or money or even material things, really. It defines itself as in accordance with our hopes and our expectations. So, and one of the things we did was say, well, what does that mean? What are our hopes and our expectations? And one of the things that came out when you ask that question continually is health rather than wealth. And if prosperity is about health rather than wealth, then that totally shifts the dynamic of how you think about what the economy is doing. And so to talk about the journey between those three books, it had its origins definitely in Prosperity Without Growth. It passed through a phase in post-growth life after capitalism, and it emerged with this idea that actually, if prosperity is mostly about health, then surely the economy should be concerned as much, or possibly more, with care rather than just growth. And so the phrase, the care economy, captured that for me. And it made me realise that I hadn't said it with the clarity that could have been said when I was writing Prosperity Without Growth. And I also hadn't said it in the language that I wanted to use either, because Prosperity Without Growth was basically written for the government at that time. It was a policy document. And I remember my mother saying to me at the time when she learned that I'd written this successful book and then opened it, and she said, there's a lot of diagrams in it, Tim. And I was like, yeah, sorry about that, Mum. I'm going to write one for you that doesn't have diagrams in. And that was a part of the journey of saying, here's something really straightforward. The economy should be, to some extent, fundamentally about care, and it's not. How could you tell that story? And how could you tell it in a way, that my mum would... Unfortunately, she didn't stay here long enough to read it, but at least my feeling is that she would have kind of been able to read this book in a way that she couldn't have read Prosperity Without Growth. And so it's those two things really, a clear concept of something positive, rather than sort of question marks all over the place. And then this idea of something that would be readable by a wide audience.
Yeah, it's interesting when something that really grabbed my attention straight away. It's like you almost were having doubts. Like I think when the Ukraine war was starting and tensions in the Middle East, and you're almost having doubts about whether to write this book, would it still resonate?
Yeah.
But then you kind of came up with the perspective of, it seems blindingly obvious, but maybe it's about why doesn't the blindingly obvious happen?
Yeah, I mean, when I started writing, we were still in COVID, and we were standing on our doorsteps applauding the care workers, and care seemed to have, at that point, it seemed to have a resonance in society that it hadn't really had for quite a long time. We suddenly realised that these were the people who stood between us and death, and for that short period of time, we were glad that they were there. And then, as you say, things changed. I mean, one of the things that changed almost instantly after that was that the nurses who realised that their pay had declined by 10% in real terms in the last 10 to 15 years, asked for a pay rise. And the government said, sorry, we can't afford this. We just come out of COVID, we've got something going on in Ukraine, we can't afford to pay our nurses. And you're thinking, how can you afford not to when you've just been through what you've just been through? But the kind of the worst thing was that, and we see it even now, I mean, we see it more now, that we're rushing, and we, shortly after we came out of COVID, barely had we come out of this crisis, then we were rushing into a very, very different world, a world that was itself rushing kind of headlong towards violence. And I sat there thinking, what the fuck am I writing about care for? Nobody cares. That's gone. That moment is gone. And then, as you say, there were a couple of things that really sort of saved me from the doldrums in that. One was a book that I read by Kathleen Lynch called Care and Capitalism. And in it she makes a really, really interesting point, which is that you can't hope to understand care unless you understand its nemesis, which is violence. And so there was a kind of, that sort of brought me up short, and I thought that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Yes, nobody's that much interested in care at the moment, but we're certainly interested in violence, of, institutional, nationalized violence. And we're running down that road as fast as we can. And then the second thought, that kind of rescued me was actually, the book isn't a clear statement of an obvious thing. It is that questioning of why doesn't it happen? Why does the blindingly obvious not happen? If economy is about prosperity is about health, then surely the economy should be engaged in care. It should care about care. And it doesn't happen over and over again, even after we had COVID, even in the aftermath when nurses were pointing out they hadn't been paid. They had to go on strike for the first time in the history of the NHS. And all the budgets are being pushed into rearmament for conflict wherever we can find them, for an arms industry that is lining the pockets of its shareholders. And you just wonder why how a society can fall into such a blindingly obvious misrepresentation of what matters in society.
What we can do is we'll get into some more of those root issues, but maybe we can take a few steps back.
Sure,
What I really appreciate you do in the book is really kind of grapple with some of the definitions and understand the different understandings and kind of challenge what we understand to be health or what we know as care.
Right.
So maybe for the audience, if you could just explain a little bit about your own perspectives of health and what that means to you, what it meant to you in sharing that in the book.
There was another journey for me actually, because every life has its health journey. We start out helpless, we grow up, hopefully, we grow older. As we grow older, things don't work quite so well, and you have to, all the way along the line, you have to kind of pay some attention to your own health. And it just happened actually that in the middle of writing a book about prosperity as health, I had to pay some attention to my own health. And it drew me into an argument about what health is that I had not really encountered before. I suppose naively, I suppose I thought health is something that you have as long as you concentrate on it. And I knew something about diet and that you should eat good stuff, but as long as you keep fit and you go to the gym, everything will be all right. And ill health is something that happens to other people. And then when it comes home to roost, actually you didn't take your own advice on what to eat. And actually it turns out your blood sugar is in the pre-diabetic range, and actually the next blood sugar level that you had after trying to change your diet, you're in the diabetic range. And then the doctor wants to prescribe you with some medication and gives you the comforting knowledge that you'll be on that medication for the rest of your life. Barely mentions the fact that actually all of the conditions for that disease are about the way that I live my life. And all of the conditions for most of the diseases that we have, the chronic non-communicable diseases that we have, are rooted in how we live our lives. And they start when we're young and they build up as we get older, and then by the time we reach a certain threshold, we're diabetic, pre-diabetic, we have lung disease, heart disease, we have musculoskeletal problems, we are no longer healthy. And the journey, I suppose, that the understanding for me, because I had a sort of antipathy to the idea that I'd reached this stage and now I had to take a pill for the rest of my life, because I knew that the pills themselves had some side effects. And so I wanted to find that other route. And the route that I basically, the way that I kind of found that route, which was looking at the conditions of my life, was also a way of rethinking what I thought health was and what healthcare is. And what it seemed to me was that I, like most of the rest of society, had fallen into a kind of a trap of thinking that healthcare is just about pharmaceutical responses to underlying diseases. And I began to look into the history of that. So there's a little bit of, I mean, you could think of it in a way as a bit of a diversion in the book, but it's so fundamental to the question of care that I think it was a really insightful diversion into how we reached that stage and on what we threw away along the way. So health in the old days, really, if you go back to Hippocrates, if you go back to the naturopathy, if you go back to the early origins of lay health, health was about providing the conditions for people to live well, and the force that gives us health, this natural healing power, the healing power of nature, is what we have to protect. That was the kind of the way we thought about health until about the beginning of the 20th century. And at the beginning of the 20th century, and you could pinpoint it to a very specific report that was written by a man called Abraham Flexner in 1910, which was an attempt to professionalize medicine. And it was a very specific attempt to professionalize medicine based on the idea that what makes us sick is germs, what kills germs is drugs, and what you need is sufficient laboratory and expertise to find the right drug to kill the right germ so that we can all become healthy. And in the process, and he did this very deliberately, he outlawed naturopathy. He outlawed the idea of the healing power of nature. He outlawed actually also mainly women lay healers. And medicine became dominated by a professional class of mostly male, lab-oriented, scientific medics. And care itself was a casualty. It sort of fell by the wayside. Now, the most interesting thing about that story for me, and shocking in a way, is that the work, which became very, very influential in the US and in Europe as well, was funded by the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefellers. The robber barons of the beginning of the 20th century had suddenly seen a new market for a new product, pharmaceuticals, which they could endlessly supply and would provide growth into the economy. And that's really interesting because they were looking for growth. They were looking for that thing that I was questioning 15 years ago in Prosperity Without Growth. And they found it by undermining health and throwing away actually what is a really strongly supported model of what health is. Health is about balance. That balance is something that we return to in our bodies. In the individual organism, you return to it constantly. I mean, you're sitting here listening to me, hopefully, while your autonomic nervous system is consistently regulating your entire physiological environment without you doing a thing and without you knowing anything about it. And that model of kind of finding balance and the ability of nature to find balance is the thing that kind of got lost in modern scientific medicine.
I think there's definitely a big theme that I took away from the book, this idea of regulation and the homeostasis regulation of the body, the miracle that it is. Then also the angle of understanding more about disease as well. I think I shifted my perception of disease, where actually disease, you're explaining, is almost like the body's way of healing itself. So like actually disease not necessarily is a bad thing. And also along with stress, like actually stress is a form of almost building resilience. I love Lumbergellis' work around hormesis, like good stress.
Good
can
stress
actually be
can do
therapeutic
that.
in a way. So that's something else you want to say.
No, I mean one of the people that I looked to, and because it's partly because I'm British, and that's the history of our understanding of health and nursing, is that I stumbled on a little pamphlet by Florence Nightingale, and it's just Florence Nightingale. She had an interesting life. She basically didn't have to work, but she had this calling to work to improve people's health, and it turned her towards nursing and nursing care. And she became, well, the founder of nursing in its modern professional sense. But also, she was kind of also a medical philosopher. And I had no idea about that. I thought, well, if I go to Florence Nightingale, I get some nice stories to put in my book about care, and that'll convince people how good care is. But what I found actually was this little pamphlet, Notes on Nursing. It's about 60 or 70 pages long. And the first sentence in it just pulled me up short. It's, can we agree that to all intents and purposes, disease itself is part of a restorative process? What we look at and think of, and I thought, where's this come from? Where did this person, who was supposed to be just, this fluffy lady with the lamp in the Crimea, doing good things and being the founder of nursing, how did she come up with this idea? And the more I read through, and the more I traced back the idea, she was actually my way into this whole idea that, naturopathy had suffered from a huge casualty, and that the wisdom of a different model of health was held by people who were not even regarded in the medical establishment. I should really say here that I have benefited massively from people in the medical establishment, from doctors in the medical establishment, from interventions from surgeons, and sometimes even from those who dispense drugs. And I think it's wrong to just throw that away, so I don't want to give that impression. But my whole sense that was medicine, that was health, was overturned really by reading that one little sentence. Disease as a restorative process. Disease is what we see when the body is trying to tell you, because it's watching all the time, that the conditions under which you're living are making it sick. And that's a complete, it turns everything on its head. And it also changes your responsibility, because it says, if you get sick, it's not the responsibility of some third person that you don't know whether you can trust them, you don't know if what they're saying is true, you don't know who's paying them. It's not their responsibility to fix you, it's your responsibility to take care of your own health. And of course there are things that surgeons can do, of course there are things that primary health care can do to help that process. But when it's captured by commercial interests, it loses its efficacy, and it changes the patient-doctor relationship. It undermines your own sense of responsibility, and sometimes it leads you down completely the wrong alley.
Yeah. So that's a little exploration of health and understanding health. Maybe if we just move to care.
Yeah.
I think that was my kind of shift in my view as well. I think radically shifting. Initially thinking about care when I read this book as I'm a caring person, I'm good, my idealist self really liked me, thinking that I'm very caring, kind of claiming the moral high ground. But I think after reading this book, I can see care in a completely different way. So maybe if you could explain a little bit more about your philosophy and what you're realizing and framing around care, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all sorts of things, when we go back to that question, why does the blindingly obvious not happen? Why don't we care about care? And you have to take that seriously. And there are lots of reasons. One is that, and we can get onto it, that capitalism doesn't really, it can't profit from care in short terms. Another is that partly because it can't profit from care, the act of care is done mainly by marginalized groups, including women, ethnic minorities, people who don't matter so much in a patriarchal society. But there was another one that sort of fascinated me, which was that there's a kind of, and it was also a part of my difficulty in writing the book, which is that care has a kind of moral tone to it. It has a, if you care, then you're a good person. It's like, and if you say you don't care, then it's tantamount to, dismissing yourself as a decent person in society. It's like love and friendship and patriotism to some people. Care has kind of a moral, an almost moralistic tone to it. Is there anything wrong with that? Well, maybe and maybe not. Maybe there is something that morally we need to work on in society. Maybe having moral dialogues would help us to appreciate care better. But it's also true that people fight for the moral high ground by claiming that what they're doing is care. You know, I care about my kids by allowing them to run around in a sweet shop all day long. I care about my political friends by sending them bombs to drop on the children of their enemies. You know, that's an act of care. But what is an act of care? What does it mean to care? If it's just a moralized thing, it doesn't do any work for us. It becomes kind of almost analytically useless. And I was kind of throwing these ideas around and trying to tussle with it myself. You know, I had this sense of my own sense that I've got to prove that I'm a good person by speaking about care, but I'm in an uneasiness with that. I don't want to be in a position of I'm just claiming the moral high ground. In fact, it was one of the things that made it sort of tricky to write the book, because I had a sort of antipathy towards that, and it felt almost unscientific in a way to just claim the moral high ground around care and say, yeah, here's my latest model of an Anglo-Saxon white male to how to save the world because I'm a good person and I care. And it's just, it's almost like, it's very distasteful. I found it distasteful. So all this stuff going through my head. And then I was sitting on a beach in the middle of the night in Wales, watching the moon over the water. And this question popped into my head: does the moon care? No idea where it came from, why it was there. And at first I just thought, God, Tim, you need to take a break from writing because your head's really fucked. But then I began to think, well, if the moon cares, then in what sense might it be said to care? And then I realized that actually the moon is constantly at attention. It's always there. It's a constant, and not only is it attention, it's attention to a process of regulation. The tides come in and they go out, and you can predict to the minute where those tides are going to be at any one point in the world. That's regulation, that's balance, that's bringing things back into balance constantly. Does it matter? Well, actually, that distance between the sea and the ocean, the interstitial range, as it's called, that's where we crawled out of the ocean and onto the land and became human beings. Without the moon, we wouldn't be here. And without the moon, our climate wouldn't be livable, because the moon inclines the Earth to 23 degrees, and that's just enough to stop us either burning up or freezing as we go around the sun. The moon cares in that sense of attention and regulation, and we would not be here without it. Now, why I really like that, because suddenly it kind of was like, well, that is an act of care, because it's paying attention and it's restoring balance. What goes on in the individual organism, the autonomic nervous system, is an act of care, because it continually regulates the balance that creates our health. Maybe this is the metaphor that we need to think about in society. If health is about balance, care is the restorative force that brings us back into balance, and it allows us to then sense check all of those claims for the moral high ground. Is that an act of care to let my kids eat sweets in a sweet shop? No, because it destroys their health, it takes them out of balance. Is it an act of care to send bombs to my political friends to drop on the children of their enemies? No, because it destroys life and health and balance. And it gave me, if you like, as you sort of were suggesting, it gave me a kind of philosophical core, a dynamic and a metaphor on which to base the idea that wasn't just an appeal to our better nature.
So it's economy as care.
Yeah.
What was the as care? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that idea and those thoughts drew me out of the debate about health and the debate about health care and about care workers. They drew me out of thinking about the economy or certain subsectors of the economy as being the subject that I was writing about. And made me realize that actually economy as care is a precise reflection of that idea that what the economy is doing, it's not just about grow. It's about bringing us back into balance, about health, about nutrition, about the terrain. It's a sort of terminological thing we haven't got into, but terrain theory is a theory in the history of medicine that tried to instill some sense in the germ theory idea. Here's health, here's disease. Disease is a germ. Hit the germ on the head with a drug. Boom, that's healthcare. Terrain theory said that's not actually the way things are working. If you have a healthy organism, it can restore itself to health. The disease that you see can be a part of that mechanism. And so if you translate that idea into thinking about the economy, you're in a very, very different place. You're no longer just sort of saying, well, it is about paying nurses more. Of course it is, because this is a vital function in society. But it isn't just bigger and bigger budgets for a healthcare sector. It's a different way of thinking about what your economy is doing. And when you begin to think about it and you realize that actually there may be a part of our economy that is building health and helping care, there's another part that's profiting massively from undermining it constantly. Big food, big pharma, big ag, big tech, and even the arms industry. So many things in which we allow the economy, we legitimize them in the name of growth. These things will bring growth to us. And what they're actually doing is creating a false economy that's undermining health. And it's not even making us all as a whole more wealthy in any meaningful sense of the word.
So those are so you start to kind of paint some of the barriers, like in the midway in the book, you start to go into some of the challenges around the economy, capitalism. You actually go to Stonehenge and have this conversation with William Baumol, the economist, to explore some of the underpinning issues and challenges with our existing market. Maybe share some more about that.
I mean, I should also share that William Baumol died in 2014, I think. So he wasn't really there, and
I thought he was. I had to read it again.
But so it was. I mean, it goes back to this idea. I was writing the book for my mum in some sense, and the book is dedicated to her, by the way. So it's kind of nice in that sense. It goes back to that idea that in telling these stories, I've tried in the book to tell them in a non-economist's way. And this particular chapter, which speaks to something which is deeply economic. William Baumol was an economist. He came up with something called Baumol's disease. And his last book actually was called Baumol's cost disease. His last book was called The Cost Disease: Why Computers Get Cheaper and Healthcare Doesn't. And it's something that he develops over half a century as an economist. And it points out that when you care, you have to pay attention. When you pay attention, that takes time. And time in capitalism is money. Time is a drag. Time is something you don't want when you're trying to make a profit. And so all of the things that take time, like care and craft and creativity and the arts, he started working actually as an economist of sculpture. So he was very interested in the arts. And a set of activities that take a lot of time, they end up being second or third cousins to all the stuff that you can do really quickly, that you can do more productively, that you can do with machines rather than people, that you can work faster and faster, you work your people faster and faster. You can't do that in care you can't do that in these activities without losing the value of the activity. And he was pointing out that, in relative terms, that means the economy, in a capitalist sense, is always going to suffer these activities. It's never going to reward them properly unless you make a political choice to reward them. So, and I guess what I wanted to do in there was to highlight that that the denigration of care, the neglect of care, isn't accidental. It's not something going on in our heads. It may partly have some moral framings around it that make it tricky, but it is slap bang in the middle of the way that we have organized our economy. And that way that we've organized our economy comes back to that idea that what the economy should be doing is providing wealth. And that means that we've institutionally locked care out of the capitalist economy. And that is a big problem. I mean, it takes me back to my middle book in a way, Life After Capitalism. And the point of Life After Capitalism was to say, you know, capitalism is just a social system. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, it's really important. I accept it's really important. We're all in the middle of it. We can barely see out of it. But it is just a social system. One day it's going to be gone for whatever reason. It might be because it, you know, wrecks the planet in the process. Or it might just be that the inequalities that it creates are so unsufferable to human beings at the end of the day. But we have to begin to think about how we could go beyond it. And so this argument, you know, about the nature of this kind of work, slow work that requires attention, work of care, and that Baumol had been trying to draw people's attention to for 50 years. You know, it just kind of, and treating it, actually it's treated in the book as a kind of dream sequence, but it's there to draw out the reality that we can't get back to care by saying nice things. We actually have to shift the system that is systematically locking it out.
And what do you see as the relationship between that and, you talk about care, violence as care's nemesis, in terms of violence and the relationship to capitalism? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of things to say, and Kathleen Lynch says them very well. I mean, one of them is that capitalism is a system because it is hungry for resources, and it's very extractive of those resources. It extracts value out of the planet, out of material resources, out of people's labor, out of our time, out of our attention, even in sort of, you know, the social media, in a systematic way. And that becomes, it works its way towards violence, in part because resources are limited, so there's always going to be, at a certain point, you're always going to come into conflict for resources. I mean, look at what's happening in the world at the moment. It's not absent of the idea of resources. It's all, to some extent, Greenland, the Middle East, Venezuela. It's even now blatant that actually what one particular government in particular is doing is about resources. And in any situation where resources are limited and needs are insatiable, then you end up in conflict. So that this capitalist economy is not just denigrating care, it's leading us in the other direction towards conflict. And I don't know exactly where Kathleen Lynch would stand on this, but I think what she talks about, I mean, actually she's mostly interested in gender, which we haven't talked about very much so far. But what she does point out is that a social system like capitalism that is based on domination, that's based on extraction and constant hunger for resources, moves in two directions. It pushes care out because it doesn't contribute to that wonderful machine of growth, and it tends towards violence. And so that was one of the things, that's the way that I think that primarily I took that idea of care as violence as care's nemesis. Yeah. But I also kind of increasingly began to feel that from some of the sort of anecdotal stories that I stumbled on as well, that care is pretty much the only antidote that we have to violence. And so that you do get this sort of sense of them operating in very different ways in society, in our minds, in our social system, within capitalism and within business. And I think it's a useful way to bring that argument about the care economy into the context that we have at the moment.
And then around violence, you also go down one layer deeper to really like understand what's behind the violence. I really appreciated that section in the book. And you go into explaining our not just our physical health, but our symbolic health. So the human need to be remembered, existential fear that we're mortal, we're a mere speck. And to compensate for this, we suppress our conscious awareness of our death, push mortality into the background and deny death. But then you talk, actually Nietzsche is over there as well, like you talk about Nietzsche and just this idea of his great health becomes the driving force, the great health of the symbolic self, driving force is social progress. And this is then what drives us for capitalism, desire for power, for fame, glory.
Kind of for immortality.
This immortality.
In a symbolic sense.
This accumulation, competition, narcissism. So just, symbolic health matters, and the care economy cannot escape from that. How can we start to include this symbolic health?
Yeah, I mean, I think the symbolic health thing is really, really important. It's very clear that we don't just pursue our physiological health the whole time, and it's partly because we are social animals. We matter to each other, and our social group matters, our friends matter, our family matters, the people that we engage with matter, and we, something like camaraderie, the sense of spirit of being with people. The thing that sparked this off was actually a visit to Paris, and thinking this was almost a century after the so-called lost generation, who were a group of artists and writers who congregated in Paris in the 1920s. And I was actually there. I was there for something completely different. I was there for a meeting at the Bank of France, the central bank in France, to talk about the ideas of prosperity without growth and so on, which was in itself kind of interesting as an experience. But as I was there, and I've always had this thing ever since I first went to Paris, that it's just one of those places that is full of culture in a human social sense. And that era of the lost generation, they were sitting around in bars, smoking gauloises, drinking lots of whiskey, staying up all late all night, and probably doing their physiological health no good at all. And it made me realize that you can't just say physiological health is all that matters. This drive for what I call in the book symbolic health, the health of the symbolic body, which you could talk about as being psychological or even spiritual in some sense, this symbolic health is really important to us. And actually, the evidence says that our physiological health depends on our symbolic health. If we're anxious, if we're depressed, we suffer from that. And so even in physiological terms, you have to take psychological, symbolic health seriously. And possibly you have to take it seriously for its own sake, because it is really something that matters to us. We are not just material, physical beings. We are social beings and possibly spiritual beings. And those beings have their own health to think about and to pursue. Now that's a tricky one, partly for the reason that you mentioned, is that as soon as we've, and this is Hannah Arendt is just sitting on the back shelf there, well, her book, The Human Condition, and it was from Hannah Arendt that I one of the key distinctions, philosophical distinctions that I work with comes from, which is that, in a way, care is that hard grind of staying alive and subsistence in a physiological sense. It's about getting from one end of the day to the other. It's about making ends meet. It's about the drudge and the dirt and the messiness of physical bodies, sometimes in states of ill repair. It's drudgery. And she contrasts that with something. She contrasts that with the kind of the work that you can engage in once you've fulfilled those tasks. And there's a point in the book where she describes, once you've fulfilled those tasks, you ought to be able to relax. You could sit in the sun, you could just, read a book or think about stuff. And she says that doesn't happen because one of the things that happens as soon as you've met those basic subsistence needs and you've got all that sorted is that you realise you're going to die. And that is a stunning realisation that we have to kind of, and maybe we're the species who is most aware of it, but we are certainly aware of it. And how we respond to that matters to our psychological health. That's the point that comes from that Hannah Arendt work. And it speaks also to a psychological theory called terror management theory, which starts from that idea. It was born from a man called Ernest Becker, who wrote a book called The Denial of Death back in the 1970s. And in The Denial of Death, what Becker says is our society tries to suppress that knowledge of our own mortality constantly. We lost touch even with asking the questions about it. And that becomes dangerous because when we suppress that knowledge, we suppress our anxiety about death, and our anxiety about death comes out in these very specific ways. And there are ways that try to, I'm feeling insecure, so I want to improve my security. So I want to know that my tribe is behind me. So I am now an aficionado for my tribe, and anything that protects that, like your tribe, is a threat to me. So I'm going to engage in conflict with you. And so terror management theory traces this sequence of events that goes from our awareness of death, suppression of that awareness, the psychological implications of that, and how it comes out in a series of aggressive, territorial, conflict-ridden, violent situations. And so I was back with violence.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And so that need then becomes the expression of care, not just in physiological terms, but in psychological terms. The expression of care as a balancing force in the things that are destabilizing us, including that awareness of death, and finding those routes towards those stabilizing mechanisms that we could legitimately call care is a part of the call of the book.
And is that where you link towards the end of the book? You're suggesting that capitalism itself could be a disease, almost like a re-stabilizing force that's trying to tell us something, that's trying to create a reparative process. What might it trying to be curing?
Yeah, that was one of the bits of the conversation that I have with William Baumol in this dream sequence is, what does he think about it? And I'm not sure he answered me, I can't remember now, but the point is that if you take that thing from Florence Nightingale seriously, disease is a reparative process, okay? Disease is trying to tell us something, it's trying to cure us of something. And then you go looking for the pathogen that's causing our chronic diseases, for example, or even our psychological diseases. What is the pathogen? Where's the bug? Where's the germ that I can hit on the head with a drug? Oh dear, it doesn't live there. It doesn't even live in my individual physical body. It lives in my society. It lives in capitalism. It lives in the mechanisms that are preventing us from caring for each other. It lives in the kind of lionizing of industries that profit in pursuit of growth by weaponizing our own neuropsychology in the case of food or drugs or social media in order to make us sick. The pathogen is in the system itself. So if capitalism is a pathogen, it was a thought experiment. There's a lot in the book that's a thought experiment, an invitation to think differently about the concepts. If capitalism is the pathogen, and a la Florence Nightingale, disease is a restorative process, what is it that capitalism is trying to restore us to? And it's more of an open question than a solution, but it's a way of saying that actually one of the things it's trying to restore us to is a knowledge of how much the denial of death has undermined our own psychological security, and we have no answers to it.
Which felt like a thing at the end of the book. You didn't really, almost like you were grappling whether to offer answers or solutions. and almost felt you were satisfied enough just to have this as an inquiry or raising awareness. But in the end, we did get to some solutions and some ideas of what one could do or what we could do collectively. Would you like to share a few?
Yeah. I mean, I've worked too long as a policy advisor. You know, the economist who was writing Prosperity Without Growth for Gordon Brown's government back in 2009 was still alive and well, and in his ear was the voice of the policy advisors to those ministers saying, yes, Tim, but what can we do on Monday? What can we do on Monday? So that kind of perennial call. And I did, in the middle of writing the book, also come across a book by Alan Watts called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And in The Wisdom of Insecurity, Alan Watts has this wonderful quote, which is, the question, what shall we do about it, is only ever asked when we don't understand the problem. To understand the problem and to know what to do about it are the same thing. I just thought that was wonderful. I mean, I kind of laughed out loud when I read it, because I thought if I'd only had that in my back pocket to give to Gordon Brown back in the day, it would have been fine. Everything would have been fine. But I still felt, and I couldn't get over that. And there's always a call. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? Where do we go from here? You know, this is lovely stuff, Tim. Very fine. Maybe your mum would have liked it, but where's the policy recommendations? And so I do come back in the end of the book to what we can do. And I think the thing that strikes me about this is that when you've been through this process of understanding where healthcare went wrong, for example, where our model of health is messed up, why care is denigrated in society, there's no absence at all of things to do. You know, they range from the very, very simple, prosaic idea of pay carers what they are worth in society, to think of care as an investment, as an investment in essential infrastructure. Yeah. And if you think about it as an investment, that actually has very pragmatic consequences that you could take to Rachel Reeves in Treasury, because Rachel Reeves in Treasury treats investment differently from current spending. So if care really is that investment, we would treat it differently in financial terms. We would be able to afford it under the fiscal rules that she loves so much. And so that kind of thing, you know, and the easy thing in a way to put together a list of things that you could do tomorrow, do on Monday, is that people have been talking about many of those things for several decades. And so I draw some of those together in the last chapter and just point to the number of things that we could be doing differently. There's also more difficult things, you know, changing a culture, changing capitalism, thinking differently about the relationship between our physiological health and our psychological. None of it is easy, but food environments that make us sick, pharmaceutical companies that profit from that sickness, social media companies that undermine our psychological well-being, these things also have to be a part of the change, because while they're doing that, a sort of well-meaning call for us all to be morally more aware of our duty to care is kind of gonna go nowhere. And I think, you know, the final call in a way is for governments to understand that dynamic and to take it seriously and to realize right back to the beginning, prosperity is not about chasing growth endlessly. It is more and increasingly about our health and how that's actually being undermined in this growth-obsessed drive that we suffer from.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think as an individual, some of the things I took away was just really a reminder for myself to really how do I pay attention? How can I pay attention better in a more quality way? So I kind of took that. I don't think it was one of your recommendations, but it made me think about that. And then also really thinking about how do I practice sitting with my existential anxiety of I'm gonna die. How do I do that? What is my spiritual practice? How can I really tune into my own denial of death? So as role modeling the culture and change I want to see in the world. So I took those things away. So just before we open to questions, just one maybe final question, just about I guess your journey of the book. What I loved was almost like the creative process. And it felt like you kind of lent into the unknown, the emergence of it all. It wasn't quite what you thought it might have been. You're almost like practicing what you're preaching, letting go of control, regulating your own physical health. So I was just wondering if all of that was intentional, or how did it all happen?
Yeah, I definitely, I guess I fell into that. I mean, there were two things I think that informed that. One was I have this idea, and it goes back to that idea. I wanted to write something that people could read. And I have this idea which is totally wrong. I will accept that it's wrong, but I won't give it up. Which is that a good writing leads the reader word by word, sentence by sentence, idea by idea, and it does it so successfully that they cannot not come with you along the journey. But in order to make that work, you really have to kind of dive into that at the word by word level. And so that was a part of the way that I decided to write the book. I mean, it was partly because the ordinary way that I would thought about writing the book was so difficult because of all the other stuff that we talked about and the circumstances which changed. So this idea of actually writing it, you didn't mention, but I started my life actually as a playwright and wrote radio dramas for the BBC. And that's where I got this philosophy from, is that if you get the words right, you will bring people with you. And that was what mattered to me more in a way than producing what would be called an economics classic in some textbook definition of those terms. It was about story for me. It was about acknowledging that as the writer, my own story was a part of the journey, and it was about finding a language that could bring people along the way. It was written in a very, very different way from Prosperity Without Growth, but it was a kind of, the writing itself was a kind of exploration. It was yeah.
I love that, and all the different ways you wove in, like the politics, the personal, the place, the history, literature, myth. I found that really enjoyable, and just in awe of how you do that.
Good. It worked then, or at least it partly worked with one person.
Oh, thank you, Tim. Okay, end of my questions and exploration with you.
Thanks,
but time to open up to questions and comments. We have about half an hour, so yes, Zoe.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up, Tim, on that last point, because story is something I'm very, very interested in. So in a way, it feels like in Prosperity Without Growth, you were exploring the fact that growth, as it is defined right now, is a stuck story. And a little bit about how you're talking about this, which is absolutely fascinating, by the way, so thank you, is that care has become a locked out story.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, getting the words right is so important as part of bringing people along. So I guess I'd love to explore that a little bit more. Like how do we shift that? Because you're still exploring growth as a stuck story through this. How do we stop care being that locked out story and make it central?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not a simple way to do that. So essentially what I'm doing in the book is trying to create the philosophical underpinnings for the centrality of care. Care in the sketch that I'm drawing is like a fundamental organizing principle for organic life. I mean, I think that's scientifically supportable, that idea. And yet we've managed to lock it out. So a part of the answer to your question is that we have to find the ways of framing that philosophical argument to allow it back in. That's not in itself enough. You also have to, in a sense, motivate people. You have to bring them along with you, which is why the language part of that, the storytelling part of that is so important. And then there is another aspect, which I suspect has more to do with activism. An activist friend of mine read the book, and he said to me, having read it, as you were taking us down yet another rabbit hole, Tim, I wanted the 50-page pamphlet that I could take and bang on the table of a politician, which, I'm in the process of thinking, definitely trying to produce something close along those lines. But the point is that, philosophical activism, philosophical exploration is one thing, storytelling is another. But there is also a kind of fundamental role for activism, I think. And some of the call for that, which I explored a bit more in prosperity, in post-growth, in life after capitalism, but the idea of activism, the idea of civil disobedience, the idea of being able to say in society, this is not correct. You government are placing all your priority on the promise that these big companies bring you about growth. And in the process, you're undermining health and neglecting care. That's not society. That's not what we elected you for. And being able to say that, I think, is really, really important.
And just one response to that. I was also thinking about how you were talking about carers being, predominantly women, and it seems to me that the whole ecosystem of NGOs, charities, hospices are trying to bubble up that care approach, and I just wondered if that resonated with you.
Yeah, they are. I mean, but they're also suffering from it. You see, I think this is one of the things that's wrong with the whole NHS reform thing at the moment. Is that there were a couple of big top-down processes to reform the NHS and come up with these 3 wonderful principles, and then to sort of say, okay, we, the politicians, have done our bit. It's up to you, the NHS, to reform yourself along these lines. And that is impossible. That is an impossible task. And so all of those institutions are suffering from all of those institutional difficulties. They're suffering from the denigration of value that they have in society. They're not important parts of society. Governments even told them, I don't know if anyone read the NHS, the NHS England, I can't remember what the thing was called now, but basically it read like a sort of motivational document for a business, and the health service was told that it had to become an engine of growth, which is just such a, it's just so counter to what care is, what the welfare state was conceived of, what the health service is doing. And yet that's the terrain in which those organizations are having to operate. And it's next to impossible. So one of the messages from that, it seems to me, is that, the political process cannot just swan in top down, do a reform consultation, impose it on the NHS and expect change to happen. Because what's swamping the NHS is happening outside of their control, totally outside, almost totally outside their control. And that is, again, it takes me back to that political point, really. That is a political agenda.
Question over here.
Hi, thanks so much. That was great. I have a lot of thoughts. I'll try to keep it concise. I want to go back to that point of the idea of violence as like the nemesis to care. I think when you said that, it kind of made me think of a lot of conversations I'm having recently with friends on defense spending, where I'm Austrian, a lot of friends are German, and I think there's a lot of support for defense spending out of a feeling of care for the country and for the people who live there. And so it kind of made me wonder whether it's actually kind of a problem of boundary setting, if you know what I mean, whether the question is, what do we care about in terms of location and time, right? What sort of generations do we care for? Where do we draw the boundary geographically of the people that we care for or don't? And when you said that thing about the moon and what does it care about and how does it show that it cares, and you said, I think the moon cares by paying attention all the time.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering whether maybe care, or the nemesis of care, is not violence, but maybe lack of attention or kind of indifference.
Really interesting. I mean, I think I would say, and I think that's a really interesting question. I think I would say that the two things the moon represents. One is care, is attention. That's a part of care, and the other is the continual restoration of balance. And I think the opposite of that. One of the reasons why I like what you said is because I hadn't thought of that, the opposite of the attention bit. I'd thought of the opposite of the restorative power bit. The opposite of something that restores stability is something that stokes instability. And that's where violence comes through, for me, as the nemesis of care. But one of the things that allows us to do that stoking of instability, is to fail to pay attention to the implications of that and the people that is falling on. And so I really like that. I really like that idea. I must say it's tricky when, I mean, we live in a cultural time at which the idea of defense spending is being, I would say, augmented deliberately by politicians, by the arms industry itself, by business, even within culture. You know, we have a sort of sense of if someone's threatening us, then we're going to threaten them back, and those forces are incredibly powerful, and we can't treat a defense issue lightly. That's clear, and I'm not suggesting that we should. But I think if you pay attention to those principles of attention and stability, you get a very different answer from what we're looking at, particularly if we look at what's happening over the pond, to how you engage in international relationships.
Yeah, and I think to me it brings to mind the idea of entropy as well, where I feel like we're now trying to really maintain the stability of what we care about and what we pay attention to, without paying attention to the disorder that it brings about outside of the system that we care about.
Yeah, that's really nice. I hadn't thought of that. It's not in the book, but
I haven't read it yet, so.
no, but I do think it's got a lot. That simple fact that the opposite of attention is a turning away of attention almost is really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Questions? Yeah.
I'm curious, as I think about opposites of care, I'm curious as an economist how you would frame up greed as a philosophical thing, but also as a narrative, as you champion care. Where does greed fall into that conversation, and how?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends how you define greed, but if we think about greed, for example, as a sort of obsessive attention to having more, kind of think of Miss Piggy, you know, more is better than less, or I can't remember what the quote is exactly, but it's like greed is this, I want more however much it is, and I want more because it makes me feel good, or then I have to have more because I don't feel so good after the more that I had that I thought was going to make me feel good but didn't make me feel good. A sort of clutching after more and more all the time. And I think, you know, I think I would argue that the psychological origins of greed have something to do with insecurity. Why would I want more when I've clearly had enough? I mean, it could be because I'm fighting some emotional battle. It isn't really what looks like I'm greedy for isn't, you know, we've all done it, comfort eating, whatever, shopping, for example. I had a student who did a wonderful dissertation on you know, shopping as a kind of consolation for loss, and all of the things that express themselves as greed, when you trace them back, come somewhere close to a sort of insecurity. And philosophically, where does that place it? It places us somewhere between that argument about, you know, our existential insecurity, that we're all going to die and there's nothing we can do about it, and we're going to lose people that we love, and that's going to be awful. But it also comes back to economic security, it comes back to health security, it comes back to the things that care can bring to us, which we're constantly, you know, sweeping aside because we don't think they matter to us right now. And so I think it's a useful concept for just delving a little bit deeper into those dynamics of our insecurity, and particularly where you see greed at the level of big corporations or even big countries who are making territorial claims on other countries, that also tells us that it's driving towards violence and that it tends towards violence. That I would place greed and violence close together in the sense that both of them, I think, have fundamental insecurity as one of their drivers.
Just thinking about care with like the context of the natural environment and also farming as an example, and in particular like who has the capacity to care, like or care properly in terms of different groups of people. So like, you know, you talked before about like intensive agriculture and that kind of thing. So, you know, we may be thinking about like across the country, taking England as an example, like how much of it can we give away to intensive agriculture and how much of it should we like leave natural or rewild? And you know, it seems like perfectly reasonable or even like quite effective from a top-down level for government to like look at the country as a whole and take in data and do like modelling of like, you know, this proportion of land or percentage of land here we might want to like rewild for environmental benefit and still maybe meet our food needs. So you might say like, you know, parts of the northwest of England like isn't very profitable for farming, but like could be useful to rewild. And then, you know, you might try and land that message as government, like in focus groups with hill farms in the northwest of England. They're like, no way, like we don't want to lose our livelihood, like absolutely not. So like who's doing the most caring approach here? You know, like is that top-down approach caring for like thinking about the national need potentially, or is it like more caring for those local people in terms of their point of view? Seems like
Yeah, I mean, I think that care is always kind of multifaceted, and I mean, I think the principle. If you took the principle of care, you could not. And I mean, I think this is one of the things that we've done so badly in our industrial history is to fail to take care of communities whose industry we feel we don't need anymore, like the coal industry. I mean, classic. And it, you know, from an environmental point of view, the coal industry is a bit of a disaster. But does that mean that the people who had their livelihood, their pride, their sense of identity in that particular industry don't matter anymore? Unfortunately, the reality is mostly they were left behind. And those communities are still left behind. So, I mean, every situation is tricky because you have these kind of conflicting demands. In a sense, I think the principles cross those different levels in the sense that you're kind of looking for attention, you're looking at the point of balance, you're looking at the restoration towards that point of balance. And you're looking at that with respect to people, their livelihoods, the nation's security, and indeed the planet. So it doesn't make it definitely doesn't make it less complex, but it gives you in a way a kind of lens through which to look at those. You're talking about the land use framework that's just been published today, right? Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but would be an interesting case study to apply the principles to.
Tim, again, big fan. I read your book. I think the first book that I began when I just moved to London. Towards the end of the book, you've steered away from giving any one silver bullet or any one suggestion to mostly policymakers, but even to entrepreneurs, to care workers. Was there a reason to that?
Yes, because I didn't think it was the job of that book. I mean, I think the job of that book was to create those sort of philosophical bones and to tell the story around it and to say, if you want something to do, all of these people have said all of these things about what we should be doing. And then there's a little bit more, which is that care doesn't just live in the care system or in health or in healthcare. It lives in the economy as a whole. All of that has to be taken into account. Turning it into something, even with a kind of, at the end of Prosperity Without Growth actually had 10, people called it the 10 Commandments at the end of Prosperity Without Growth, because I did exactly that, 10 policy recommendations. Nobody ever listened to them, as far as I know, in government. And so I think, and I do think that you shouldn't really, you shouldn't listen to the 10 prescriptions of one man who happens to have written a book and say, yeah, that's the answer. You have to engage in that process. And so it was a call for policy and for politicians to engage at that level. And also it would have made the book very, very long if I had.
If your other book was about policy and the kind of macro scale of things, then is this book a bit more about like community organisation or individual organisation and drive and us having a sense of agency to create that change? Because I feel like personally for me the structure that exists now is giving us less time and the funds to pay other people to do all these things, and actually the opportunity that is potentially presenting itself with a 4-day week is that rather than us having more leisure time, is that we have more community-based time, and that we invest that in projects and we invest that in people around us and creating rituals again, and like that's, I haven't read your book yet, but I would imagine to me that would be
It's a part of what I have in the book, certainly that idea about individual agency, and I'm a big fan of that kind of community-based approach. There's some really good community-based approaches in relation to health. I mean, Q Foundation really is kind of exactly trying to create that sort of community, right?
Yes, we at Q Community, my colleague here as well, we are helping to staff and patients to kind of create good examples of what's working in health and how to improve that and how to scale it up. So some really exciting examples, and especially with the neighbourhood health, the whole push towards neighbourhood health. We're doing a lot of work in that. So there are quite a few great examples, and we hope, especially with the Department of Health and Social Care, there's going to be more of an emphasis on population health and looking at that holistic approach to change, which involves communities and community health workers. So I do have hope that things will change.
And there are lots. There's the College of Medicine and Integrative Health, which also has a lot of that pushing in that direction. There's individual organisations growing health together. Is one of them. Health begins at home. Lots of community organisations, I think. And so the book it doesn't explicitly talk about them in great detail. I think the message is empowering in the sense that it makes that point, that is possible, but it also makes another point, which is less of a happy point in a way, which is that, and it was actually brought through to me by another book that I read called The Logic of Care by Anne-Marie Moll, and she makes a really important point in that book, which is that at the individual level, if I'm diagnosed with diabetes, I can change my diet. I can go out and do it. If I have sufficient resources, if I have enough willpower, if I've read the right books, if I have a supportive partner, I can do that. But anyone who's tried to do it knows you're swimming against the tide. Anyone who's tried to do it knows that you can no longer shop in the way that you shopped before. Anyone that's tried to do it knows that the supermarket is trying to undermine that decision every time you walk through the aisles. And the point that Anne-Marie Moll makes in The Logic of Care is that what's possible at the individual level does not translate into change at the level of population health until the conditions of the population change. And that's the really important thing, that I love the community-based stuff, and I love what Jen is doing at Q Community, and I love all of these examples. And I'm absolutely for empowering people to change individually, but it isn't enough when they're being conspired against by a system that isn't changing.
Yeah, a thought occurred to me, and I haven't really framed it properly yet, but you talked at the beginning about how you didn't spend a lot of time on it, but how thinking about how we grow beyond capitalism, or how capitalism grows into something different. And there's another thing in my mind, I can't quite remember where it's from, but the quote that technology exists to free up human hands to do the things that only human hands can do, and which imagines this notion that when technology advances to a place where we don't need to do things ourselves, it means that we can focus on the nursing, the care, and the teaching of children and all that stuff. And I suppose what I'm wondering, the incentives that force the incentives within capitalism that push this endless march of growth. I mean, you've outlined lots of ways in which it is in conflict with the existence of good, positive care and health, but it doesn't need to be always against those things. And I suppose I wonder how you envisage the growth of capitalism, or as in the maturing of capitalism into something else, or the growth of us moving past capitalism, like which bits of it, if any, would we want to keep, and how do we get rid of the stuff we don't? What is the actual trajectory that you see?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and quite a complicated one in a way. I mean, your starting point is something that I totally agree with. In fact, I make the argument in the book, essentially, that the care economy, this set of relational activities that only humans can do, I mean, it has some wonderful characteristics. It improves our quality of life. It tends to be less materials intensive because it's about time and care and attention and people. And that means it has lower environmental impact. And if you get the conditions right, people working in those sectors have much more job fulfillment than working in, the mass manufacturing supermarket economy that capitalism loves and draws upon. So could this transition be towards that relational economy, but not throwing away technology? That's basically what you're kind of saying, isn't it? And I think that is exactly what we should be thinking of. But we have to think about the conditions under which that might happen. So, and it's unfortunate that the way that that's happened has created a kind of schism between the care sectors, these relational activities that only humans can do, that we ought to be protecting, and the bits of the economy that are designed to make money as fast as possible, and quite often for only a few people. So while technology is doing that, it's not giving people time, it's not giving them livelihoods, it's not providing them with resources, and it's taking away from the safety net of those relational activities, care and education, and social care and health and art and creativity and things that inspire us. That bit of the economy suffers because resources are drawn continually into this bit that is chasing growth, and the technologies that are helping us to do that are becoming ever more complex and ever more concentrated on very, very few people. So if you think about AI, for example, I mean, it's driven by the material and economic and financial, I would say greed, to come back to that word, of a very small number of people who see enormous wealth as being the possible outcome from this. That schism is going to get wider and wider. It's not going to be something that would allow us to develop that economy. So what do we need to stop that happening? I think we need definitely some regulation of this runaway economy, which maybe even we can't even call capitalism anymore. Maybe it's something Yanis Varoufakis calls it techno-feudalism, because these are enormously powerful people with control over most of the rest of society. So some control of that runaway, technologically driven greed, but without destroying the technological possibilities altogether. And that means you need some kind of transfer mechanism. You need to think about ownership. You need to think about who owns those technologies, and how much of the rewards from those technologies actually is it legitimate in society for those people to run away with, when the rest of the care economy, the relational activities, all those things you mentioned, are suffering. And I think if you can get those, if you can get those two things right, then you can definitely, the direction of travel to find a way out of a kind of growth-obsessed capitalism.
The first one might be, like, if you don't mind, I want to ask two questions. Like, the first one would be, how much hope do you have? And I'm asking because, like, it seems like there's a lot of work. Like, the ones here, we probably already agree with, like, the principle of the book. But, like, the ones not here, like, maybe they don't, like, this is kind of related to the attention idea. Like, there are people who don't see, like, other groups as humans, and then, like, there's no way they would, like, buy into the idea of care. And then there are also people who are, like, benefiting from the status quo, and to promote, like, this sort of economy, we would have to, like, go against them in some ways. And I just feel like there's such a gap between reality and, like, the idea of what can be. So, like, I don't know, like, it feels quite hopeless. Yeah. The second one is a little bit more personal. That is, like, you have done a lot of work in different fields and in different styles, like more artistic and also, like, more analytical in, like, policy making. And then this book is a little bit more, I guess, go back to more philosophical and artistic. Like, are there, like, different selves in you, or how do you reconcile, like, different modes?
That's easy. There's definitely different selves in you. Yeah, there's the policy wonk, there's the poet, there's the playwright, there's the philosopher. There's a few other things as well, which, but I think, yes, I definitely see that, and I think, I mean, actually, Jen hasn't mentioned this, but she used to work for
Psychosynthesis.
Psychosynthesis, sorry. Psychosynthesis Foundation, which actually is an entire psychology built on the idea that we all have different selves, and that most of the time they war against each other in us, and that the route to healing is to find some way of getting them to speak to each other in a synthetic way, which is a really nice psychological model I like. I haven't always been successful in following that, but I think the care economy is probably the most successful I've been in following it. Your first question is, have you read the book yet?
A little bit.
A little bit, okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe I want to come back to you when you've read the whole book to see whether you've got more hope or less hope. But I do, I mean, yeah, there are definitely times when you think, why would I do, what's the point? It is hopeless. I mean, especially, increasingly with what we're looking at. But I have this idea, I have this kind of metaphor, which is, I have a couple of metaphors really about that. One is that what we're talking about, these ideas, and one of the things I do when I write is to try to create the historical narrative of these ideas. They don't just exist now in me or in you. You didn't just think of them. They are integral parts of what it means to be human, of the human psyche, of our intellectual history, of our poetic history, of our religious thought. You can trace these ideas, and so one of the things that I've tried to do in this book and Post-Growth is to create this trace of ideas. Like, I think of it like almost like this little thread going along through history. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down, but it's always there. And at the moment we are definitely in a period where what's happening up here is violent, is aggressive, is selfish, is careless, is creating an economy that doesn't work even in its own terms, that is moving towards chaos. But these strands are the ones that are most important of all. And although it doesn't give you necessarily a sense of hope that what's going on down here can totally get rid of these nasty trends, it gives you something to focus on. And that, I think, is, it's almost like, to me, I feel that thread of humanity, and the evidence shows it, is what has allowed us to survive and evolve and to be here at all. And so the act of focusing on it is an act of resistance against this violence that we see all around us, irrespective of whether people listen to it, whether it seems like it's there in the rest of society, whether capitalism likes it or not, whether we value it or not. That thread is always there, and being able to focus your attention on it gives you it strengthens it in your own mind, and it also allows you to, I would say, just drop a pebble in a pond and watch the ripples, and that sense, it's a very unscientific argument that I'm making. It's nothing to do with which policies, but it's speaking, I hope, directly to your and many other people's sense of hopelessness, that the hope isn't a kind of conscious act of will to be hopeful. It's a focusing of attention on this thread that is so constant and so essential to humanity.
I think that's a brilliant and very poetic way, and profound way to end this part of the conversation. But we do have another hour, and there's drinks, and there's amazing people in the room, and there's books to buy, and Tim to talk to. So yeah, do join us for drinks in another hour. But before we do, just say great thank you to Tim and for all the work
Thank you, Jen.
that you do.
Thank you.
But
Thanks for coming.